On the 12th, during a storm of wind, the Boudius, whose anchor cable had been cut by the coral, caused great injuries to the Edel, upon which she was driven, whilst all on board were busily occupied in repairing these injuries, and a boat had been dispatched in search of a second passage, by means of which the ships might have left with any wind. Bougainville learned that 3 natives had been killed or wounded in their cabins by bayonets, and that owing to the general alarm, all the inhabitants had hurried to the interior. In spite of the risk run by his ships, the captain at once landed and put the supposed perpetrators of this outrage, which might have brought the entire population upon the French, into irons. Thanks to these rigorous measures, the natives calmed down, and the night passed without incident. Still, Bougainville's worst apprehensions were not upon this score. He returned on board as soon as possible. But for a breeze which opportunely sprang up, both vessels would have been driven on shore by a strong squall, accompanied by a swell and thunder. The anchor cables broke, and the vessels had a narrow escape of striking on the breakers, where they must speedily have been demolished. Fortunately, the Edel was able to gain the open, and was soon followed by the Boudius, leaving in this foreign roadstead 6 anchors, which might have been of great use during the rest of the voyage. So soon as they perceived the approaching departure of the French, the natives came in crowds with provisions of every variety. One of them, named Aoturu, asked, and finally obtained, permission to accompany Bougainville on his voyage. After his arrival in Europe, Aoturu lived 11 months in Paris, where he was received with cordiality and welcome in the highest society. In 1770, when he returned to his native land, the government took an opportunity of conveying him to the Isle of France. He was to return to Tahiti as soon as the weather permitted, but he died in the island without having been able to convey to his land the useful implements, grains, and cattle, which had been given to him by the French government. Tahiti, which was named Nouvelle Sither by Bougainville, on account of the beauty of the women, is the largest of the society's group. Although it was visited, as we have already narrated, by Wallis, we will give a little information which we owe to Bougainville. The principal productions were cocoas, bananas, breadfruits, yams, sugar cane, and C. M. de Commerson, naturalist who was on board the Edel, recognized the Indian flora. The only quadrupeds were pigs, dogs, and rats, who multiplied rapidly. Bougainville says, "The climate is so healthy that in spite of our fatigues, although our people were perpetually in the water, and under a burning sun, sleeping on the naked soil under the stars, no one was ill. The sufferers from scurvy whom we disembarked, and who had not enjoyed a single night's sleep, regained their strength, and were so soon restored that some of them were completely cured on board." In addition to this, the health and strength of the natives, who live in cabins open to every wind, and who scarcely cover the ground, which serves them as a bed, with a few leaves, the happy old age to which they easily attain, the sharpness of all their senses, and the singular beauty of their teeth, which they preserve to the greatest age, all testify to the salubrity of the climate, and the efficiency of the rules followed by the inhabitants. In character, the people seem gentle and good. It would not appear that they have civil wars among themselves, although the country is divided into little portions under independent chiefs. They are constantly at war with the inhabitants of the neighboring islands. Not satisfied with massacring the men and male children taken in arms, they skin their chins with the beard and keep this hideous trophy. Bougainville could only obtain very vague information of their ceremonies and religion, but he could at least assert the reverence they pay their dead. They preserve the corpses for a long time in the open air, on a sort of scaffold sheltered by a shed. In spite of the odor of decomposition, the women go every day to weep near the monuments, and bedew the sad relics of their beloved ones with their tears and with coconut oil. The soil is so productive, and requires so little cultivation, that men and women live in a state of almost entire idleness. Therefore it is not astonishing that the sole care of the latter is to be pleasing. Dancing, singing, long conversations, teeming with gaiety, have developed a mobility of expression among the Tahitans, surprising even to the French, a people who themselves have not the reputation of being serious, possibly because they are more lively than those who reproach them with levity. It is impossible to fix a native's attention. A trifle strikes them, but nothing occupies them. In spite of their want of reflection, they were clever and industrious. Their pirogues were constructed after a fashion equally ingenious and solid. Their fish hooks and all their fishing implements were of delicate workmanship. Their nets were like those of Europeans. Their stuffs manufactured of the bark of a tree were generally woven and dyed of various colors. In fact, Bougainville's impression of the Tahitan people was that they were Lazzaroni. At 8 o'clock on the 16th of April, Bougainville was about 10 leagues north of Tahiti when he perceived land to windward. Although it had the appearance of three islands, it was in reality but one. It was named Almeida after Aaturu. The captain, not thinking it wise to stop there, steered so as to avoid the pernicious islands, of which Rogween's disaster had made him afraid. During the remainder of the month of April, the weather was fine, with little wind. On the 3rd of May, Bougainville bore down towards a new land, which he had just discovered, and was not long in finding others on the same day. The coasts of the largest one were steep. In point of fact, it was simply a mountain covered with trees to its summit, with neither valley nor sea coast. Some fires were seen there, cabins built under the shade of the coconut trees, and some 30 men running on the shore. In the evening, several pirogues approached the vessels, and after a little natural hesitation, exchanges commenced. The natives demanded pieces of red cloth in exchange for coconuts, yams, and far less beautiful stuffs than those of the Tahitans. They disdainfully refused iron, nails, and earrings, which had been so appreciated elsewhere in the Bourbon archipelago, as Bougainville had named the Tahitan group. The natives had their breasts and thighs painted dark blue. They wore no beards. Their hair was drawn into tufts on the top of their heads. Pirogue of the Marquesas Islands. Pirogue of the Marquesas Islanders. Next day, fresh islands belonging to the archipelago were seen. The natives, who appeared very savage, would not approach the vessels. The longitude of these islands, says the narrative, is pretty nearly similar to that which Abel Tasman reckoned it when he discovered Amsterdam and Rotterdam Islands, the Pulstars, Prince William Island, and the low lands of Vleemskirk. It is also approximate to that assigned for the Solomon Islands. Besides the pirogues which we have seen rowing in the open sea, and to the south, indicate other islands in this locality. Thus it appears likely that these lands form an extended chain in the same parallel. The islands comprising the Navigator Archipelago lie below the 14th southern parallel, between 170 degrees and degrees west longitude from Paris. As fresh victuals diminished, scurvy again began to appear. It was necessary to think of putting into a port again. On the 22nd and the following days of the same month, Pentecost Island, Aurora and Leper Islands, which belonged to the archipelago of New Hebrides, were reconnoitered. They had been discovered by Quiros in 1606. The landing appearing easy, the captain determined to send an expedition on shore, which would bring back coconuts and other anti-scorbutic fruits. Bougainville joined them during the day. The sailors cut wood and the natives aided in shipping it, but in spite of this apparent good feeling, the natives were still distrustful and carried their weapons in their hands. Those who possessed none held large stones, all ready to throw. As soon as the boats were laden with fruit and wood, Bougainville re-embarked his men. The natives then approached in great numbers and discharged a shower of arrows, lances, and javelins. Some even entered the water, the better to aim at the French. Several gunshots, fired into the air, having no effect, a well-directed general volley soon put the natives to flight. A few days later, a boat seeking anchorage upon the coast of the Leper Islands was in danger of attack. 2 arrows aimed at them served as a pretext for the first discharge, which was speedily followed by a fire so well directed that Bougainville believed his crew in danger. The number of victims was very large. The natives uttered piercing cries as they fled to the woods. It was a regular massacre. The captain, uneasy at the prolonged firing, sent another boat to the help of the first. When he saw it doubling a point, he therefore signaled for their return. "I took measures," he said, "that we should never again be dishonored by such an abuse of our superior forces." The easy abuse of their powers by captains is truly sad. The mania for destroying life needlessly, even without any object, raises one's indignation. To whatever nation explorers belong, we find them guilty of the same acts. The reproach, therefore, belongs not to a particular nation, but to humanity at large. Having obtained the commodities he needed, Bougainville regained the sea. It would appear that the navigator aimed at making many discoveries, for he only reconnoitered the lands he found very superficially and hastily, and of all the charts which accompany the narrative, and there are many of them, not one gives an entire archipelago, or settles the various questions to which a new discovery gives rise. Captain Cook did not proceed in this way. His explorations, always conducted with care and with rare perseverance, are for that very reason far superior in value to those of the French explorer. The lands which the French now encountered were no other than Saint Esprit, Malicolo, and Saint Bartholomew, and the islets belonging to the latter. Although he was perfectly aware that these islands were identical with the Tierra del Espiritu Santo of Quiros, Bougainville could not refrain from bestowing a new name upon them, and called them the Archipelago des Grand Cyclades, to which, however, the name of New Hebrides has been given in preference. I readily believed, he says, that it was its extreme southern point which Roggwin saw under the 11th parallel, and which he named Tinehoven and Groning. But when we arrived there, everything led us to believe that we were in the southern land of Espiritu Santo. Every appearance seemed to coincide with Quiros's narrative, and the discoveries we made every day encouraged us in our search. It is singular that precisely in the same latitude and longitude as that which Quiros gives to his St. Philip and St. James bays, upon a shore which at first sight appeared like a continent, we found a passage equal in size to that which he gives to the opening of his bays. Did the Spanish navigator see badly, or did he wish to hide his discoveries? Had geographers merely guessed in making the Tierra del Espiritu Santo identical with New Guinea? To ascertain the truth, we must follow the same parallel for over 350 leagues. I resolved upon doing so, although the state and quantity of our provisions warned us to seek a European settlement as soon as possible. It will be seen that we narrowly escaped being the victims of our own persistence. Whilst Bougainville was in these latitudes, certain business matters required his presence on board the Edel, and he there found out a singular fact, which had already been largely discussed by his crew. M. de Commerson had a servant named Bar. Indefatigable, intelligent, and already an experienced botanist, Bar had been seen taking an active part in the herborizing excursions, carrying boxes, provisions, the weapons, and books of plants, with endurance which obtained from the botanist the nickname of his beast of burden. For some time past, Bar had been supposed to be a woman. His smooth face, the tone of his voice, his reserve, and certain other signs appeared to justify the supposition, when on arriving at Tahiti suspicions were changed into certainty. M. de Commerson landed to botanize, and according to custom Bar followed him with the boxes, when he was surrounded by natives, who, exclaiming that it was a woman, were disposed to verify their opinion. A midshipman, M. Baumand, had the greatest trouble in rescuing her from the natives and escorting her back to the ship. When Bougainville visited the Edel, he received Bar's confession. In tears, the assistant botanist confessed her sex, and excused herself for having deceived her master, by presenting herself in man's clothes at the very moment of embarkation. Having no family, and having been ruined by a lawsuit, this girl had donned man's clothes to ensure respect. She was aware, before she embarked, that she was going on a voyage round the world, and the prospect, far from frightening her, only confirmed her in her resolution. Amdil Bar's adventure. Amdil Bar's adventure. She will be the first woman who has been round the world, says Bougainville, and I must do her the justice to admit that she has conducted herself with the most scrupulous discretion. She is neither ugly nor pretty, and at most is only 26 or 27 years old. It must be admitted that had the two vessels suffered shipwreck upon a desert island, it would have been a singular experience for Bar. The expedition lost sight of land on the 29th of May. The route was directed westward. On the 4th of June, a very dangerous rock, so slightly above water that at 2 leagues distant it was not visible from the lookout, was discovered in latitude 15 degrees 50 and degrees 10 longitude. The constant recurrence of breakers, trunks of trees in large quantities, fruits and sea wrack, and the smoothness of the sea all indicated the neighborhood of extensive land to the southeast. It was New Holland. Bougainville determined to leave these dangerous latitudes, where he was likely to meet with nothing but barren lands and a sea strewn with rocks and full of shallows. There were other urgent reasons for changing the route. Provisions were getting low. The salt meat was so tainted that the rats caught on board were eaten in preference. Bread enough for 2 months and vegetables for 40 days alone remained. All clamored for a return to the north. Unfortunately, the south winds had ceased, and when they recommenced, they brought the expedition within an inch of destruction. On the 10th of June, land was seen to the north. It was the bottom of the Gulf of the Louisiade, which had received the name of Cul-de-sac de l'Orangerie. The country was magnificent. On the seashore, a low land covered with trees and shrubs, the balmy odors of which reached the ships, rose like an amphitheater towards the mountains, whose summits were lost in the skies. However, it was impossible to visit this rich and fertile country, but on the other hand, desirable to find to the east a passage to the south of New Guinea, which, by way of the Gulf of Carpentaria, would have led direct to the Moluccas. Did such a passage exist? Nothing was more problematic, for the notion was that land had been seen extending far to the westward. It was needful to hurry as fast as possible from the Gulf, where the ships had so incautiously involved themselves. Map of Louisiade Archipelago. Louisiade Archipelago. Facsimile of early engraving. But there is a wide difference between a wish and its fulfillment. The two vessels strove in vain up to the 21st of June to transport themselves to the west, from this coast, which was so full of rocks and breakers, and upon which the wind and currents bade fair to swallow them up. The fog and rain continued so closely with them that the frigate could only proceed in company with the Edel by a constant firing of guns. When the wind changed, they profited by it and immediately proceeded to the open sea. But it soon veered again and continued east-southeast, and thus they speedily lost the ground they had gained. During this terrible cruise, the rations of bread and vegetables were obliged to be reduced, consumption of old leather was threatened with severe punishment, and the last goat on board was sacrificed. It is difficult for the reader, tranquilly sitting in his chimney corner, to imagine the anxiety of a voyage in these unknown seas, threatened with the unexpected appearance of rocks and breakers, with contrary winds, unknown currents, and a fog which concealed all dangers. Cape Deliverance was only rounded on the 26th. It was now possible to start for the north-northeast. 2 days later, when they had made about 60 leagues northward, some islands were perceived ahead. Bougainville imagined they were a part of the Louisiade group, but they are more generally accepted as belonging to the Solomon Archipelago, which Carteret, who saw them the preceding year, as little imagined that he had reached, as the French navigator. Several pirogues speedily surrounded the two ships. They were manned by natives, blacker than Africans, with long curling red hair. Armed with javelins, they uttered shrill cries and showed dispositions far from peaceful. It was useless to attempt to reach them. The surge broke violently, and the coast was so narrow that it scarcely seemed as if there were one at all. Surrounded on all sides by islands, and in a thick fog, Bougainville steered by instinct in a passage only 4 or 5 leagues in width, and with a sea so rough that the Edel was forced to close her hatchways. Upon the eastern coast, a pretty bay was perceived, which promised good anchorage. Boats were told off to sound it. Whilst they were thus engaged, 10 or more pirogues, upon which some 150 men armed with bucklers, lances, and bows, were embarked, advanced against them. The pirogues divided into two parties to surround the French boats. As soon as they were within sufficient reach, the natives showered a storm of arrows and javelins upon the boats. The first discharge failed to stop them. A second was necessary to disperse them. 2 pirogues, the crews of which had jumped into the sea, were captured. Of great length and well made, these boats were decorated in front with a man's head carved, the eyes of which were formed of mother of pearl, the ears of tortoise shell, and the lips painted red. The water in which this combat took place was called the Warrior River, and the island received the name of Choiseul, in honor of the French Minister of Marine. On leaving this strait, a new land was discovered. Bougainville Island, the southern extremity of which, called Laverdy Cape, appears to join Bouka Island. The latter, which Carteret had seen the preceding year, and which he named Winchelsea, appeared densely populated, if the cabins which abounded were any criterion. The inhabitants, whom Bougainville classifies as Negroes, probably to distinguish them from the Polynesians and Malays, are Papuans, of the same race as the inhabitants of New Guinea. Their short curly hair was painted red, and the betel nut, which they perpetually chewed, had communicated the same color to their teeth. The coast, with its coconut and other trees, promised plentiful refreshments, but contrary winds and currents quickly drew the ships away. On the 6th of July, Bougainville cast anchor on the southern coast of New Ireland, which had been discovered by Schouten, in Port Praslin, at the very point where Carteret had stopped. "We sent our casks on shore," says the narrative, "and began to collect water and wood and commence washing, all of which was most necessary. The disembarkation was splendid, upon fine sand with neither rock nor wave. 4 streams flowed into the harbor in a space measuring 400 paces. We selected 3, according to custom, one to supply water for la Boudeuse, one for the Edel, and one for washing purposes. Wood was plentiful on the shore, and there were various kinds of it, all good for burning, and several first-rate for carpentry, joinery, and even toy-making. The 2 vessels were in hearing of each other and close to the shore. Again, this part and its neighborhood to a great distance were uninhabited, a fact which secured us precious peace and liberty. We could not have hoped for a surer anchorage, or a more convenient spot for water, wood, or the various repairs needed by the vessels. We were able to send the sufferers from scurvy to range the woods. But with all these advantages, the port had a few inconveniences. In spite of active search, neither coconut trees nor bananas were to be found, nor any of the resources which either by consent or by force could have been gained in an inhabited country. Fish was not abundant, and we could expect only safety and strictly necessary things. There was every fear that the sick would not reestablish their health. We had indeed no serious cases, but several were infected, and no improvement took place, and their malady could not have increased more rapidly. They had been only a few days in port, when a sailor found a leaden plate upon which was an inscription in English. It was easy to guess that they had found the very spot where Carteret had made a stay the preceding year. The resources offered by this country to sportsmen were mediocre in the extreme. They did indeed catch sight of a few boars or wild pigs, but it was impossible to hit them. To make up for this, they shot most beautiful pigeons, the bodies and necks of gray-white and of golden-green plumage, turtle doves, paroquets, crested birds, and a species of crow, whose cry was so like the baying of a dog as to be mistaken for it. The trees were large and magnificent, amongst them the beetle, the areca, and the pepper tree. Malignant reptiles swarm in these marshy lands, and in the ancient forests, serpents, scorpions, and other venomous reptiles abounded. Unfortunately, they were not only to be found on land. A sailor in search of marto, a very rare kind of bivalve mussel, was stung by a serpent. The fearful suffering and violent convulsions which followed only subsided at the expiration of 5 or 6 hours, and at last, the theriac which was administered to him after the bite effected a cure. This accident was a sad damper to conchological enthusiasm. Upon the 22nd, after a severe storm, the ships were sensible of several slight earthquakes. The sea rose and fell several times in succession, which greatly alarmed the sailors who were occupied in fishing. In spite of the rain and ceaseless storms which continued daily, a detachment started to search the interior for bourbon palms, palm trees, and turtle doves. They expected to find wonders, but returned oftenest empty-handed, and with the one result of being wet to the skin. A natural curiosity at some distance from the anchorage, 1,000 times more beautiful than the wonders invented for the ornament of kingly palaces, attracted numberless visitors, who could never tire of admiring it. It was a waterfall, too beautiful for description. To form any idea of its beauty, it would be necessary to reproduce by the brush the sparkling gleam of the spray lit up by the rays of the sun, the vaporous shade of the tropical trees, which dipped their branches into the water, and the fantastic display of light over a magnificent country, not yet spoiled by the hand of man. As soon as the weather changed, the ships left Port Praslin to follow the coast of New Guinea until the 3rd of August. The Edel was attacked by hundreds of pirogues and forced to return the stones and arrows that assailed her by a few gunshots, which put the assailants to flight. On the 4th, the islands named Matthias and Stormy by Dampier were sighted. 3 days later, Anchorite Island was recognized, so called because a number of pirogues occupied in fishing took no notice of the Edel and Boudius, disdaining to enter into relations with the strangers. After passing a series of islets half under water, upon which the vessels nearly struck, and which were named the Echequers by Bougainville, the coast of New Guinea appeared. Steep and mountainous, it ran west-northwest. On the 12th, a large bay was discovered, but the currents, which so far had been unfavorable, were equally so in carrying the boats far from it. It was visible at a distance of 20 leagues from two gigantic mountains, Cyclops and Bougainville. The Aramoa Islands, the largest of which is only 4 miles in length, were next seen, but the bad weather and the currents forced the two vessels to remain in the open sea and relinquish all exploration. It was necessary, however, to maintain a close watch in order to avoid missing the outlet into the Indian Ocean. Mispulu and Waigiu, the last at the extreme north of New Guinea, were passed in succession. The Canal des Francaise, the outlet for ships from this mass of little islands and rocks, was passed without mishap. From thence Bougainville penetrated to the Molucca archipelago, where he reckoned upon finding the fresh provisions requisite for the 45 sufferers from scurvy on board. In absolute ignorance of the events which had occurred in Europe since he left it, Bougainville would not run the risk of visiting a colony in which he was not the strongest power. The small Dutch establishment, Boten or Buru Island, suited him perfectly, all the more that provisions were easily obtained there. The crew received orders to enter the Gulf of Cajeti with the greatest delight. No one on board had escaped scurvy, and half the crew, Bougainville says, were quite unfit for duty. The victuals remaining to us were so tainted and ill-smelling that the worst moments of our sad days were those when we were obliged to partake of such disgusting and unwholesome viands. The charms of Boten Island were enhanced by our wretched situation. About midnight, a delicious odor, emanating from the aromatic plants with which the Molucca Islands are covered, had been wafted several leagues out to sea, and was hailed by us as a forerunner of the end of our woes. The appearance of the moderately sized town, situated below the gulf, with vessels at anchor and cattle grazing in the pastures that surrounded it, caused pleasure in which I participated, but which I cannot describe. Scarcely had the Boudius and the Edel cast anchor, than the resident governor sent 2 soldiers to inquire of the French captain what reason he could assign for stopping at this place, when he must be aware that entrance was permitted to the ships of the India Company only. Bougainville immediately sent an officer to explain that hunger and sickness forced him to enter the first port which presented itself in his route. Also, that he would leave Boton as soon as he had received the aid of which he had urgent need. The resident at once sent him the order of the governor of Amboina, which expressly forbade his receiving any strange ship in his harbor, and begged Bougainville to make a written declaration of the reason for his putting into port, in order that he might prove to his superior that he had not infringed his orders except under paramount necessity. As soon as Bougainville had signed a certificate to this effect, cordiality was established with the Dutch. The resident entertained the officers at his own table, and a contract was concluded for provisions and fresh meat. Bread gave place to rice, the usual food of the Dutch, and fresh vegetables, which are not usually cultivated in the island, were provided for the crews by the resident, who obtained them from the company's gardens. It would have been desirable for the re-establishment of the health of the crew that the stay at this port could have been prolonged, but the end of the monsoon warned Bougainville to set out for Batavia. The captain left Boton on the 7th of September, convinced that navigation in the Molucca archipelago was not so difficult as it suited the Dutch to affirm. As for trusting to French charts, they were of no use, being more qualified to mislead vessels than to guide them. Bougainville therefore directed his course through the Straits of Button and Salire, a route which, though commonly used by the Dutch, is but little known to other nations. The narrative therefore carefully describes, with mention of every cape, the course he took. We will not dwell upon this part of the voyage, although it is very instructive, and on that account interesting to seafaring men. On the 28th of September, 10 months and a half after leaving Montevideo, the Edel and the Bugis arrived at Batavia, one of the finest colonies in the world. After touching at the Isle of France, the Cape of Good Hope, and Ascension Island, near which he met Carteret, Bougainville entered St. Malo on the 16th of February 1769, having lost only 7 men in the 2 years and 4 months which had elapsed since he left Nantes. The remaining particulars of the career of this fortunate navigator do not concern our purpose, and may be dismissed briefly. He took part in the American War, and in 1781 participated in an honorable combat before Port Royal off Martinique. Made chief of the fleet in 1780, he, 10 years later, received a commission to re-establish order in the mutinous fleet of M. d'Albert de Rions. Created vice-admiral in 1792, he did not think it right to accept a high rank, which was, to use his own words, a title without duties. Nominated first to the Bureau of Longitudes, and then to the Institute, raised to the rank of senator, created a count by Napoleon I, Bougainville died full of years and honors, on the 31st of August, 1811. Bougainville acquired popularity as the first Frenchman who accomplished a voyage round the world. Though the merit of discovering and reconnoitring, if not of exploring, many groups of islands little known and quite neglected before his time, has been ascribed to him, he owes his reputation rather to the charm and easy animation of his narrative than to his labors. If he is better known than many other French naval officers, his competitors, it is not so much because he accomplished more than they, as because his style of narrating his adventures charmed his contemporaries. As for Guillaume Duclos, his secondary share in the enterprise and his plebeian rank excluded him from reward. He was afterwards given the Cross of St. Louis, but he earned the title by his rescue of the Belle Poule. Although he was born in 1722 and had been in the Navy since the year 1734, he was still only lieutenant in 1791. A succession of ministers of new views was needed to obtain the rank of ship captain for him, a tardy recompense of long and signal services. Guillaume Duclos died at St. Servan on the 10th March, 1794. Chapter 3. Captain Cook's First Voyage. 1. The beginning of his maritime career. The command of the adventure entrusted to him, Tierra del Fuego, discovery of some islands in the Paumotu archipelago, arrival at Tahiti, manners and customs of the inhabitants, discovery of other islands in the Society Group, arrival at New Zealand, interview with the natives, discovery of Cook's Strait, circumnavigation of 2 large islands, manners and productions of the country. In narrating the career of a distinguished man, It is well to neglect none of those details which may appear of but slight importance. They acquire significance as indications of a vocation unknown even to its subject, and throw a light upon the character under consideration. For these reasons, we shall dwell a little upon the humble beginning of the career of one of the most illustrious navigators whom England boasts. James Cook was born at Marton, in Yorkshire, on the 27th of October, 1728. He was the ninth child of a farm servant and a peasant woman named Grace. When scarcely 8 years of age, little James assisted his father in the rough toil of the farm of Airy Home, near Eighton. His amiability and love of work attracted the interest of the farmer, who had him taught to read. When he was 13 years of age, he was apprenticed to William Sanderson, a linen draper at Snaith, a fishing hamlet of some importance. But young Cook found little pleasure in an employment which kept him behind a counter, and he spent every leisure moment in chatting with the sailors who visited the port. Gaining his father's consent, James soon left the linen drapers to engage himself as shipboy to Messrs. Walker, whose boats carried coal from England to Ireland. Successively shiplad, sailor, and master, Cook rapidly learned all the details of his profession. In the spring of 1755, as the first hostilities between England and France broke out, the boat upon which Cook served was anchored in the Thames. The navy was recruited in those days by means of press gangs. At first Cook hid himself, but afterwards, urged no doubt by a presentiment, he engaged himself on board the Eagle, a vessel of 60 guns, to the command of which Sir Hugh Palliser was soon appointed. Intelligent, active, thoroughly at home in all the details of the service, Cook was noticed by the officers and attracted the attention of his captain, who in a short time received a letter of warm recommendation from the member for Scarborough, sent in accordance with the pressing solicitations of all the inhabitants of Eighton for young Cook, who shortly afterwards received a warrant as boatswain. He embarked upon the Mercury, bound for Canada, upon the 15th of May, 1759, and joined the fleet of Sir Charles Saunders, who, in conjunction with General Wolfe, conducted the siege of Quebec. In that campaign, Cook found the first opportunity of distinguishing himself. Ordered off to sound the St. Lawrence between Orleans Island and the northern shore of the river, he executed his task with much skill and drew up a chart of the channel in spite of the difficulties and dangers of the enterprise. His hydrographical sketch was acknowledged to be so exact and complete that he received orders to examine the channels of the river below Quebec. This duty he performed so well that his chart of the St. Lawrence was published by the English Admiralty. After the capture of Quebec, Cook passed on to the Northumberland, under command of Lord Colville, and profited by his stay on the shores of Newfoundland to devote himself to astronomy. Important operations were now entrusted to him. He drew up the plan of Placentia and took the bearings of St. Peter and Miquelon. In 1764, he was made naval engineer for Newfoundland and Labrador, and was employed for 3 consecutive years in hydrographical tasks, which obtained for him the notice of the ministry, and helped to correct innumerable errors in the maps of America. At the same time, he addressed a treatise to the Royal Society of London, upon an eclipse of the sun, which he had observed in Newfoundland in 1766. This document appeared in the Philosophical Transactions. Cook was not long in receiving a due reward for so much and such successful labor, and for his patient studies, the more meritorious as he had had few opportunities and was self-taught. A scientific question of the highest importance, viz., the transit of Venus across the sun's disk, which had been announced for 1769, was eagerly discussed by all the scientists of the day. The English government, confident that this observation could only be effectually made in the Pacific Sea, resolved to send a scientific expedition thither. The command was offered to the famous hydrographer A. Dalrymple, equally celebrated for his astronomical investigations and his geographical discoveries in the southern seas. But he was so exacting in his demands, and so persevering in his request for a commission as ship's captain, which Sir Edward Hawker as obstinately refused, that the Secretary of the Admiralty proposed another commander for the projected enterprise. His choice fell upon James Cook, who was cordially recommended by Sir Hugh Palliser, and to him, therefore, the command of the Endeavour was given, whilst he was at the same time raised to the rank of ship's lieutenant. Cook was now 40 years of age. This was his first appointment in the Royal Navy. The mission entrusted to him called for varied qualifications, rarely to be met with in a sailor. For, although the observation of the transit of Venus was the principal object of the voyage, it was by no means the only one. Cook was also to make a voyage of discovery in the Pacific Ocean, but the humbly born Yorkshire lad was destined to prove himself equal to his task. Whilst the Endeavour was being equipped, her crew of 84 men chosen, her store of 18 months' provision embarked, her 10 guns and 12 swivel guns, with the needful ammunition, shipped, Captain Wallis arrived in England. He had accomplished his voyage round the world. He was consulted as to the best spot for the observation of the transit of Venus, and he selected an island which he had discovered, and which was named by him after George Roman III. It was later known by its native name of Tahiti. From this spot, therefore, Cook was to take observations. Charles Green, assistant to Dr. Bradley of Greenwich Observatory, embarked with him. To Green was entrusted the astronomical department. Dr. Solander, a Swedish doctor of medicine, a disciple of Lin O's, and professor at the British Museum, undertook the botanical part. Finally, Sir Joseph Banks joined the expedition, out of simple interest, anxious to employ his energy and fortune. After leaving Oxford, Sir Joseph Banks had visited the Newfoundland coast and Labrador and had there acquired a taste for botany. 2 painters accompanied the expedition, one a landscape and portrait painter, the other a scientific draftsman. In addition to these persons, the company comprised a secretary and 4 servants, 2 of whom were Negroes. The Endeavour left Plymouth upon the 26th of August, 1768, and put into port at Funchal, in the island of Madeira, on the 13th of September, to obtain fresh fruit and make discoveries. The expedition met with a cordial reception. During their visit to a convent, the staff of the Endeavour were entreated by the poor immured recluses to let them know when it would thunder, and to find a spring of fresh water for them, which they sorely needed, in the interior of the convent. With all their learning, Banks, Solander, and Cook found it impossible to satisfy these demands. From Madeira to Rio de Janeiro, where the expedition arrived on the 13th of November, no incident interrupted the voyage, but Cook's reception by the Portuguese was hardly what he expected. The whole time of his stay in port was spent in disputes with the viceroy, a man of little knowledge, and quite incapable of understanding the scientific aspect of the expedition. However, he could not well refuse to supply the English with fresh provisions, of which they had absolutely none left. As, however, Cook was passing Fort Santa Cruz on leaving the bay, 2 shots were fired after him, whereupon he immediately cast anchor and demanded the meaning of the insult. The viceroy replied that the commandant of the fort had orders to allow no vessel to leave the bay without his having received notice, and although Captain Cook had notified his intention to the viceroy, it had, by pure neglect, not been communicated to the commandant of the fort. Was this an intentional act of discourtesy on the part of the viceroy, or was it simple heedlessness? If the viceroy was equally negligent in all the details of his administration, the Portuguese colony must have been well regulated. Cook entered the Straits of Le Maire on the 14th of January, 1769. Kippis, in his Life of Captain Cook, gives the following account. The sea ran so high that the water was above Cape San Diego, and the vessel was so driven by the wind that her bowsprit was constantly under water. Next day anchor was cast in a small harbor, which was recognized as Port Morris, and soon afterwards they anchored in the Bay of Good Success. Whilst the Endeavour remained off this spot, a strange and untoward adventure befell Banks, Solander, Dr. Green, and Monkhouse, the surgeon of the vessel, and their attendants. They were proceeding towards a mountain in search of plants, and as they climbed it they were surprised by cold, so penetrating and sudden that they were all in danger of perishing. Dr. Solander was seized with vertigo, 2 Negro servants died on the spot. Finally, the gentlemen were only able to regain the vessel after a lapse of 2 days. They rejoiced in their deliverance, with a joy which can only be estimated by those who have escaped similar dangers, whilst Cook showed a lively pleasure in the cessation of the anxiety their absence had caused him. This event gave them a proof of the severity of the climate. It was the middle of summer in this part of the world, and the day, when the cold surprised them, had begun as warmly as an ordinary May morning in England. James Cook was enabled to make some curious observations upon the savage inhabitants of those desolate regions. Destitute of the necessaries of life, without clothes, without efficient shelter from the almost perpetual severity of this glacial latitude, unarmed, and unlearned in any industrial art which would enable them to construct the more necessary utensils, they passed a miserable life and could only exist with difficulty. In spite of these facts, of all the articles offered in exchange, they invariably chose the least useful. They joyfully accepted bracelets and necklaces and rejected hatchets, knives, and fishhooks. Careless of what we consider valuables, our superfluities were their necessaries. Cook had reason to congratulate himself upon the selection of this route. He took 30 days to double Tierra del Fuego, from the date of his entrance into the Straits of Le Maire to his arrival, 3 degrees north of Magellan. No doubt a much longer time would have been needed if he had followed the winding course of the Strait of Magellan. His very exact astronomical observations, in which Green joined him, and the directions he gave for this dangerous navigation, smoothed the difficulties of his successors and rectified the charts of 50 Hermite, Le Maire, and Scout. Captain James Cook. Captain James Cook. Facsimile of early engraving. Cook noticed no current of any importance from the 21st January, the day upon which he doubled Cape Horn, to the 1st of March, in a distance of 160 leagues of sea. He discovered a good many islands in the dangerous archipelago, which he respectively named Lagoon, Arch, Groups, Birds, and Chain Islands. The greater number were inhabited and were covered with vegetation, which to sailors who for 3 months had seen only sea and sky, and the frozen rocks of Tierra del Fuego, appeared luxuriant. Soon they found Mardia Island, which Wallis had named Osnaburg, and on the next day, 11th of June, the island of Tahiti was reached. 2 days later, the Endeavour cast anchor in Port Matavai, called Port Royal by Wallis, and where that captain had had a struggle with the natives, over whom, however, he had triumphed without much difficulty. Cook, aware of the incidents of his predecessor's stay in this port, wished above all to avoid similar scenes. Moreover, it was essential to the success of his observations that no interruption or distraction should occur. His first care was to read out standing orders to his crew, which they were forbidden under heavy penalties to infringe. He first declared that he intended in every possible way to cultivate friendly relations with the natives. Then he selected those who were to buy the needed provisions, and forbade all others to attempt any sort of traffic without special permission. Finally, the men who landed were on no pretext to leave their posts, and if any soldier or workman parted with his arms or implements, not only would the price be deducted from his wages, but he would be punished in proportion to the exigency of the case. In addition to this, to guard the observers from attack, Cook decided on constructing a sort of fort, in which they might be sheltered within gun range of the Endeavour. He then landed with Messrs. Banks, Solander, and Green, soon found a favorable spot, and in presence of the natives immediately traced out the extent of land he intended to occupy. One of them, named Oha, who had had friendly intercourse with Wallis, was particularly profuse in his protestations of friendship. As soon as the plan of the fort was fixed, Cook left 13 men and an officer in charge of the tents and accompanied his associates into the interior of the island. But he was speedily recalled by the sound of firing. A very painful incident, the consequences of which might have been serious, had occasioned this. One of the natives had surprised a sentinel near the tents and had possessed himself of his gun. A general discharge was immediately directed upon the inoffensive crowd, but fortunately no one was injured. The robber, meantime, was pursued and killed. A great commotion ensued, and Cook was profuse in his protestations to pacify the natives. He promised payment for all that he required for the construction of his fort, and would not allow a tree to be felled without their sanction. Finally, he had the butcher of the Endeavour mastheaded and flogged for threatening the wife of one of the chiefs with death.